Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. Now, many people suppose that the subject of ancient human giants is one that is tied only to the Bible or the classical Greek stories of the Titans. But this is not the case. There are stories of giant humans that can be found in Mesoamerican lore, produced in the era of the Spanish conquistadors, all the way into the late 19th and early 20th centuries in North America. Another example comes from 17th and 18th century reports of European explorers encountering giant, and this is their term, Indians, in what is now the southeastern United States. Again, giant Native Americans is the way we would say this today. These first-hand reports and their subsequent artistic portrayals of those encounters have survived to this day. Now the question is, do these reports and the artistic renderings provide good evidence of giants in North America in the days of European colonization and the early United States? Well, let's find out on this episode of Fringe Pop 321. Now, there have been a few studies published in scholarly journal literature about our topic today. Did colonial era explorers encounter Native Americans that were giants? One such study by Mehmet İskan and Morten Kessel provide a summary of the colonial data at our disposal in their scholarly research. And they write this as follows, quote, "Historical reports of giant American Indians in the southeastern United States encountered by early post-Columbian explorers are extensive and persuasive. Many sources on Southeast American Indian literature mention post-contact Indians and describe them as tall in stature. Indeed, explorers and travelers throughout the Americas reported these newly discovered peoples as being of great height." Unquote. Now, another study, this one by a scholar whose last name is Swanton, has collected these reports and published them. In his 1979 book, The Indians of the Southeastern United States, specifically on pages 219 through 229, Swanton has excerpts of a number of such reports from explorers' journals. I'm going to read you a few of these, preceded by the name of the explorer and the date. So in Swanton's work, for instance, he cites the Journal of Catesby in 1731, who wrote, "The Indians of Carolina are generally tall," unquote. Strachey, 1849, "The Powhatans are generally tall of stature." Bartram, who was a traveler and a botanist from 1773 to 1777, wrote, quote, "Cherokee men are of gigantic stature, many of them above 6 feet. The Cherokee are the largest race of men I ever saw. The Muscogulas are in stature nearly equal to the Cherokee," unquote. And lastly, Macaulay from 1887 writes, "The Seminoles attract attention by their height. The men of the Tiger clan are over 6 feet in height." Well-known artists like Jacques Lemoyne de Morgue, who was a French engraver and painter from the 16th century, and Theodore de Bry, who was a Flemish engraver, again in the late 16th century, depicted Native Americans in this region as tall. In this example, Lemoyne's portrayal of Timucuan, Chief Athor, is a good bit taller than the French explorer. Another example includes Captain John Smith, believe it or not, of Pocahontas fame. In his 1624 book, A General History of Virginia, this depiction of Smith taking the Powhatan tribal chief prisoner shows the chief to be much larger than Smith. A third example comes from de Bry, whose drawing of Amerigo Vespucci on the so-called Isle of Giants clearly shows several Native American women taller than the European men. Now the question before us is pretty obvious. Do these artistic portrayals depict giant Native Americans? Well, it depends on what you mean by giant. If the notion is that European explorers encountered indigenous people who were obviously taller than they were, the answer is pretty obviously yes. If, however, the notion being suggested is that we have people who were freakishly tall, like 8 feet or higher, the answer is no. Now recall that the explorer reports we took note of earlier in this episode are mostly vague. Most of them simply say that the native inhabitants were quite tall, but 2 of them give us an actual measurement. Bartram wrote that the Cherokee men are of gigantic stature, many of them above 6 feet. So gigantic meant taller than 6 feet, at least to this writer. Macaulay wrote, the men of the Seminole Tiger clan are over 6 feet in height. Now, these notes are important in light of skeletal remains. Native American burial remains in the southeastern United States region align with this 6-foot threshold for unusual height. Studies of those remains have shown that the average height for men among the native population was around 5 foot 7 inches tall, and the women measured a bit shorter at 5 feet 5 inches tall. The tallest specimen among the skeletal remains that have been recovered to date measures in at 6 feet 4 inches tall. So a height of 6'4" would have been considerably taller than most of the Native American population, and it also would have been taller than European men, whose average height for the period was around 5 feet 7 inches, just like the natives. Now, it's conceivable that these early reports are accurate, that the European explorers encountered natives, and maybe a good number of them, that were over 6 feet tall. It's also conceivable that the artistic portrayals, especially in the example of John Smith, are somewhat exaggerated. Smith defeating a much larger native would have added to his legend and his reputation, which we know historically he was keen on cultivating. So where does this leave us? Well, we have some good primary source information from these journals of explorers, and we also have artistic representations that are at least consistent with what the explorers said, but we have to go with what they said. Gigantic Native Americans, the indigenous population, were measured by these Europeans as, wow, a lot of these guys are over 6 feet tall. Again, that isn't exactly what we think of when it comes to giant lore. And it also really isn't exactly what is sort of put forth on the internet, various websites, in regard to this topic. Oftentimes, viewers of these websites or these YouTube channels are just shown these pictures and told, wow, look, the explorers ran into giants. And they'll never quote the actual journals to sort of give it context. And they'll never cite the literature about the skeletal remains of both the Native Americans in this part of the older United States or of European heights. And once you know the information, these reports can be true. They can be valid, but they're really not what a particular website or maybe a show or a YouTube channel is really hoping that you'll believe. So thanks for watching this episode of Fringe Pop 321. Please visit our website, fringepop321.com, for more information about the sources we used in this episode and, of course, all our topics. And if you're interested in supporting what we do here, go to fp321.com/S, as in the letter S, and come back and watch more episodes, because what you know may not be so.